I was just curious. I never had imposition when I was growing up. I don't ever remember doing it in Tomahawk. My first exposure was at college at the chapel, at Concordia Chapel, and then the seminary did it. My vicarage church didn't have that practice, and then when my first two congregations in Stanley and then here, we didn't do it. And then I got to Rapids and they did. So okay, we'll start doing it. And then other places we always have. So. The palms from Palm Sunday, they get burned, and then that's where you make the ashes. Yeah.
I learned that this morning. I was reading. Jack Bird, I think, had it.
Oh, did he? Yeah, he had a little thing on Ash Wednesday. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well,
Are palms still up there?
I have a bunch of them. We're not going to do ashes this year. Maybe we'll start that next year. Maybe I'll chat with the elders, see what they think, and do some educating on it and advertise it, not spring it on everybody. All right, well, let's get at it today. Our readings for the first Sunday in Lent are going to be from Numbers chapter 21, verses 4 through 9, and then we're going to do 1 Corinthians 10. The first 13 verses, we're going to skip a couple verses, and then Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, the temptation of Jesus. The gospel for each of the 3 years in the lectionary, always are, for the first Sunday is always on the temptation of Jesus. That's just a tradition, right? So that's where we're going to be. And we're going to be starting a little new sermon series for these Sundays in Lent called Journey for the Gold. It's a bit different kind of a sermon. It's a fictitious story that I basically create. And it's an ongoing building story of this speed skater by the name of Johnny Pilgrim. Pilgrim, does anybody know what pilgrim means? It literally means a wanderer. That's what pilgrim means, a wanderer. It's a few churches are named Pilgrim. Pilgrim Lutheran in Green Bay is one of them. And so wanderers in the desert, in the wilderness, right? And so this is a thing where it's kind of built off, if you remember the Dan Jansen story from sometime in the 80s, maybe the late 80s. He was a speed skater from West Allis, a very prominent speed skater, and the story with his sister and some sickness that she had and things like that. So it kind of starts with that as the premise, and then it just interweaves a bunch of biblical themes that I noticed running through the scriptures that were set for these lessons, that my friend Michael Card would write. He wrote a devotional book called The Walk. Many years ago, he called it The Walk, a devotional book on discipleship. And he kind of wrote the book built upon, did you ever read Tuesdays with Morrie? Mm-hmm. So that was Mitch Albom's book that he wrote about spending this time with a man dying, right? His friend Morrie. And he wrote the book. Well, Card had this spiritual mentor in his life, a guy by the name of Professor Bill Lane. Near Bill's end of his life, he had been diagnosed with stage 5 cancer or something like that, and they knew the end was coming. So he moved to Nashville, and he says, Mike, I'm going to teach you one more lesson, how a Christian man dies. And so he just kind of built it from his lifelong of 30 years of walking spiritually in spiritual faith with this mentor in his faith, and all the things that he taught him. And he just called it the Walk. And so there's themes out of that intertwine then, and then just themes from my own personal life that kind of weave their way through this fictitious story. So it kind of builds the progression each week of the story. And this first week, the theme is called The Painful Purpose of the Wilderness. There is a purpose for the wilderness. Not a good purpose. I mean, it's a good purpose, but it's a painful purpose. And in the midst of it, we see God at his hand working throughout it. And that's kind of going to be the theme that drives this first week. And I think these 3 lessons kind of will help facilitate that message and that theme. Okay? So we're going to start in Numbers chapter 21. Does anybody know what how the books of the old Moses, the books of Moses got their names, the first 5 books, it's usually in reference to the first words of the Bible or of the book. So Genesis means beginning, right? So in the beginning. Exodus means departure. Okay, those are the Greek names, and the Numbers is from the title Numbers comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's not the Hebrew name. The Hebrew name for the book of Numbers is actually called In the Wilderness. That's the name of it, right? That's the name of it.
I thought it was more genealogy.
It is. That's why the first 10 chapters of genealogy, that's why the Septuagint does Numbers for its title, but the Hebrew title is Beth Midbar, which means in the wilderness, because it actually contains a lot of great stories of what happens in the wilderness, which is one of these stories here from Numbers 21. All right, so let's dig at it. We're going to read verses 4 through 9, probably a pretty familiar story. It's often the Old Testament lesson that gets connected with the Gospel, John 3:16, because you'll see, well, actually it's John 1 through 16, because of the story of the snake on the serpent. Right? So, let's take a look. I got to get my cheaters on. Verses 4 through 9, chapter 21. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route of the Red Sea to go around Edom. The people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses, and they said, "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in this wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water. We detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake, and he put it up on a pole. Then anyone who was bitten by the snake looked at the snake, the bronze snake, and he lived. All right, we'll start with y'all. Again, probably a pretty familiar story. Any thoughts or questions that you all have in regards to this initial reading?
So they're in the wilderness,
They are.
and they're complaining about the food.
Yeah.
So was this before the Lord sent the quail, and
No, this is after.
it says there is no bread?
Right. All we have is, and then they do have food. All we have is this miserable food. It's manna, right? They don't know what it is.
Oh.
That's why they call it manna, because manna means what is it? It just says it was like coriander flakes. I always envision it like instant mashed potatoes, right? It was flaky in the morning. They would gather it. They would make a bread-like thing from it, but it wasn't bread like made out of yeast and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So it was kind of like maybe like rice cakes.
I always think about it like a communion wafer.
Yeah, it wasn't. It wasn't like a big loaf of bread, right? Which is what they're saying. And the word bread is kind of sometimes just a generic word for food. But I think here it specifically means like big muffins, big loaves of bread. You know, all we got is this miserable food, this manna, right? Manna bagels, manna burgers, manna. They got this manna. And they want something different, right? That's
How long do you think they've been in the desert at this point?
that I don't know, but they've been traveling, and part of it is they traveled from Mount Hor along the edge of the Red Sea, and they had to go around Edom. Okay, so Edom is they're cousins, right? Edom is the descendants of Esau. Okay, so they're the descendants of Jacob. Edom is the descendant of Esau, but they've been at odds with one another, and now they've come out of this slavery. Then now they're on this refugee journey. and they got to go around it. And the visual is like they feel like they're going in circles, right? We're just going around in circles, Moses. And it says that they grow impatient. They're impatient on the way because it just feels like they're just going in circles. They're just spinning their wheels and getting nowhere, going nowhere. Got no water. Well, they do have water. They just have to depend upon God to get it for them. They got no food. Well, they do get food. God provides it for them. It's just they're not like satisfied with what God's been doing for them, right? What have you done for me lately, God? And so they're impatient. And then they speak against God. Yeah. So yeah, this is in the wilderness.
Did he say realize that when the bad things started happening, they said, we brought this on ourselves.
Yes.
We spoke bad about Moses and about God.
They owned it, didn't they?
Yeah, and that at least made me feel better that they acknowledged
Sure.
that they'd done wrong.
In my handwritten notes, somewhere along the line when I read through the story, I just wrote, spiritual growth, no more excuses, just confession.
Mm-hmm.
So they finally owned on it. They owned it for themselves, right? What else did you got any questions about or wonderments on?
Well, the snakes wouldn't have been very much fun.
No, the snakes would not have been fun, right? So here they are. They're grumbling. They're complaining. They speak against God. They speak against Moses. They're complaining about, you brought us out of Egypt for this wilderness. We got nothing, no water, no drink. We only got this miserable food that we're not happy with anymore. And so God sends venomous snakes. Seems kind of harsh, doesn't it?
But his solution to it, I'm not sure I feel like it was a good idea. I mean, put a statue on a pole, and when the people go to the pole and look at the statue, they're going to be restored.
Yeah.
It's
like worshiping an idol.
Yeah. It almost encourage that.
Yeah. So this has become, by the way, the serpent on a staff is today still a symbol of what? Medical help. Yeah, it is. It did become an idol in the land.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Later on, it did.
Mm-hmm.
But it also becomes an image that Jesus will use in John 3. John 3:14 and 15, Jesus would say, and just like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness and the people looked on it and lived, so the Son of Man, referring to himself, is going to be what? Lifted up.
Yeah.
And people will look and be healed.
I have a note in my Bible that says, what did Jesus say about the bronze snake? And it is going back to John 3:14.
And then John 3:16, of course, is John's summary of that Jesus speech. I think it's John, not Jesus, saying, for God loved the world, that he gave his only son. Yeah. So, the fact that it could become something that was worshipped and become an idol, yeah, very easily it could have. But it also became a means of healing, didn't it? Because they didn't pray for the healing, did they? What did they pray for? What did they actually pray for? The people, what did the people pray for? What did they ask God to do? Or what did they ask Moses to pray for?
That you take the snakes away.
Yes. They pray for the snakes to be taken away.
Oh.
Okay. They pray for the snakes, for the test, for the consequence to be taken away. Did God do that? No. The snakes are still there. The snakes are still biting.
They could just be healed from it.
They can be healed from it. What's God testing them on? Could God have just simply said, okay, fine, they confess, I'll take the snakes away? Of course he could have. Of course he could have. He didn't do it that way, though. They still got bit. The snakes are still there. They're still getting bit. What does God provide, though, in the midst of that? A way to be healed. How do you get healed?
Go to God.
Follow what he's prescribed. Look up at that, and there's a
Listen.
yeah, it's part of it is listening and then doing, right? And trusting that God is faithful. That if I look at this and I focus on that instead of the snakes, I'll be healed. It doesn't take the pain of getting bit away, right? The fear of getting doesn't take any of that away, but it does provide something in the midst. And in that test, God is saying, what's going to happen to their faith?
It'll get stronger.
It will get stronger. They'll learn to stop grumbling and complaining and depend upon God. Depend, He's faithful. Which is, that's the purpose of the wilderness. That's the purpose of the wilderness. So, what do you envision when you see or hear wilderness?
A large expanse of nothing.
Yeah, large expanse of nothing. Yeah, good, that's good. What else?
The desert that it doesn't reap anything.
Desert, yeah.
It just, it's
Hard living.
It's not rich. It's not. It doesn't have any of that
Yeah.
to offer.
It's not vibrant.
No.
Yeah, it's barren.
Yeah.
It's dry. It's vast. It's nothingness.
It's probably hot.
Hot. Cold at night. Hot in the day.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that's where they are. Right? That's where they are. And God is forming them and shaping them in the wilderness to be His son. Because He does call Israel His son, right? Out of Egypt I called my son. That's what God says about Israel. They're His son, His children, His sons and daughters. And He's establishing their sonship. He says, I love you. They're not going to get loved more by God, but they're going to be shaped and strengthened by God as sons and daughters in that wilderness. That's where their sonship, that's where their daughterhood gets established, in the wilderness. When they're learning, God is faithful. God is trustworthy. He is dependable. Even when I'm getting bitten by snakes, right? He's going to send a way to be healed. So these things we've been grumbling about, no water, this miserable food, no bread, in the end, God's been taking care of that too. And they're learning that God's going to be faithful for them too. All right, anybody else on this passage? So look up and live. Look at that snake on the pole and live. And whenever they got bit, that was it. They still get bit. Right? What they asked for, God did not do. He did not take the snakes away, but did provide a way to be healed and restored. Okay, good. Well, let's take a gander at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. All right, so we spent a couple weeks in the first couple chapters of Corinthians. So remember the type of congregation this was? What do you remember about this group of people called the Corinthian congregation?
They all had their own reason for being there.
Yeah, they got factions and divisions. They're Jew and Gentiles, right? They love philosophy, they love eloquence and good rhetorical speaking and persuasive speech. They're fascinated with all that. They live in a big major city, a seaport. Paul spent a lot of time there founding the congregation, left it in the hands of people, got word from others as he was sitting in Ephesus that they've been having these struggles. They're struggling with divisions. And he finds out they're struggling with sexual immorality, which was just a general way of their life before being Christians. They were struggling with that. They've been struggling with lawsuits. They've been bringing lawsuits against each other. And eventually, the book's going to go on. They're struggling with their understanding of gifts. And the most important gift that God gives to people is love. And all the other gifts, if you don't got love, they're nothing, right? And then they're struggling with how to practice the Lord's Supper. Don't get drunk. That's one of the big things. Don't come drunk to the meal. Share with one another, which they're not doing. They don't even believe in. Some of them don't even believe in the resurrection, right? So there's some struggles going This one has to do now with their struggle with idolatry, and Paul is going to use the warnings from their history in the wilderness, right? The people in the wilderness, and they would have resonated. They would have understood this image really quickly because it was just part of their story. Yeah, this is the story of salvation. All right, so chapter 10. For I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact, right? Or what does the ESV have? We don't have any ESV people here today. We've got the NIV. What Bible you got there, Miss Mary? What you got? What does your verse say? I don't want you to be ignorant or uninformed.
For I want you to know, brothers.
What's the rest?
Grade 1 then?
Yeah, chapter 10, verse 1.
Yeah.
Can you read first the whole verse?
For I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea.
Oh, really? That's what I want you to know. That's an interesting translation. It probably should be uninformed or ignorant, rather than I want you to know. Yeah, interesting. ESV did that, but that shocked me a little bit. Oh well, they're wrong. Verse 1. I don't want you to be ignorant. And ignorant doesn't mean stupid, right? Ignorant just means uninformed, yeah. I don't want you to be uninformed, brothers, of the fact that our forefathers were under the cloud, that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food. They drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them. And that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. Now, these things occurred as examples, to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it was written. The people sat down to eat and to drink. They got up to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. But in one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord, as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So if you think that you are standing firm, be careful that you do not fall. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. So I'm curious, as the ESV, I should have looked at this earlier myself. Does the ESV for verse 13 have temptation or test?
Temptation.
Really? They have temptation as well. Okay.
So,
To me, the better word for temptation in this context is the word test. No, test. The word can mean both in the Greek. It can mean temptation and test, and they're kind of similar, but we have in our English language a little bit different understanding of those two words. Don't we? When we think of the word temptation, what do we generally think of?
the devil.
The devil, yeah, the devil, leading to sin. Kind of like taking a little dangling thing and going, and pulling it away. And it can mean that. How do we understand the word test? How is that a little bit different for us in our English understanding of testing versus temptation?
Testing is supposed to be like the reminder of things from the past, that had been committed wrong.
That's what Paul is saying, right?
Yeah, on verse 8, when it's talking about in one day 23,000 of them died, what was that?
Well, that's when they built the golden calf, and then they had a big sexual orgy.
And everyone was killed that was there.
They were,
23,000. I guess I never looked at it as those kind of numbers.
the numbers are hard to understand.
Mhm.
But, yeah. So verse 8 is actually not part of our reading on Sunday. 7 and 8, but it is there, yeah. Just because if if it would be hard to, well, it's there and it's important to hear it, but I actually used that last year in our Bible study on the book of Exodus. We used this text when we did our preaching sermon Lent series on Exodus last year. I talked about the sexual immorality that came out of that idolatrous event and God's reaction.
So how many people were there altogether? Is there any?
It's hard to know. There's a lot of debate on that. The Hebrew numbering systems are hard to translate. Yeah. When you read the book of Numbers, they talk up to like over 1 million. There's a lot of debate on that, though. That because for an Israelite person, when they would say, how many of us have passed through the sea, the Red Sea? How many of us came out of Egypt? They would say, we all have.
Because it would be all the children's children.
Yeah, it was their own experience, their salvation experience, right? So we all have. And so by the time that the book of Numbers actually gets written and edited and collated into a scripture form, are they taking that number?
Yeah.
Or are they taking the number of the group that first came out? Yeah, physically came out. It's hard to know.
It says that Paul is not striving for preciseness.
With the number? Yeah. It seems maybe a little exaggerated, but we don't know that for sure. It's hard, but it is hard to calculate the number. It's a ragtag group of refugees, and I've always thought the million seems too high. In the millions, it seems too high. That it was probably a smaller group. But again, it's not something I'm going to die for. Yeah, it's not a huge pattern. Some people will go to if it says it, then it's got to be, and if you deny that number, then you deny the scriptures are really are authoritative and inspired by God. And okay, that's fine. So, but it's a good question, but it's hard to really know the number. Now, when we get to like the book of Acts, and it says 3,000 were baptized that day. Well, that's easy to see, right? I've actually seen 400 people get baptized in one day. So that's not unimaginable. But 1 million? 23,000 dead in one moment? Hard to know.
I mean, if there was only 50,000 to start with, that would
Right.
be big.
Right. Yeah. So it's hard to. Yeah. But Paul's point is, God takes it pretty seriously, right? Idolatry and anything that leads towards it, and then sometimes his judgment's going to be swift. And what Paul is saying now, all of this is happening. It sets a pattern, an example for believers of all ages. God's pretty serious about this stuff. Right? All right, so let's go back to the beginning, verse 1 there. And he talks about how he doesn't want us to be uninformed about the cloud. They all were under the cloud and they all passed through the sea. So he's obviously, and then he talks about the spiritual food and the spiritual drink. That's all should trigger us into thinking, what event is he writing about? What is he reminding us about? The story of the Exodus and the wilderness wandering. What's the cloud reference to? The cloud, yeah, the pillar.
Being with them.
The pillar that led them, the cloud that led them, and the pillar of fire at night. The back guard, the front guard, God's presence in their midst, right? The God who rescued them forms in this cloud, appears in this cloud, and in the pillar of fire. And then the sea, what's that reference to?
The sea?
Yeah, the sea.
The Red Sea?
The Red Sea. What happened there?
Parting of the water.
parting of the waters, and they're passing through the Red Sea, right? So that moment of salvation, when God fought for them, they just had to stand still, let God do the work. So this is all, like, he's just tracing for us the story of the book of Exodus, right? And then into the wilderness wanderings. Then they all ate the same spiritual food, the spiritual drink, and that was actually, then he says, who was with them the whole time? That was Christ, right? So how did they get their water in the wilderness? Do you remember?
And it was from a stone.
Yeah, striking a rock. Moses would strike a rock, and the waters would come. Well, that rock was, Paul saying in a spiritual way, that's Jesus. He was with them. Jesus was with them throughout the wilderness wanderings. But yet, nevertheless, what? God was not pleased with most of them. Why? Why did their bodies scatter the wilderness?
They sinned.
They said, and they failed to trust God.
Hearts of evil.
They failed to trust God, to walk in his ways, to trust that he is there. Now, when they did the wrong, God sent venomous snakes, but he also sent healing for some of them too, didn't he? For those who would depend. And that's what Paul then gets down to then in verse 11. Right? All of this happened to them as examples for us, written down for us, for the fulfillment of this ages. So, if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. What might that be?
I think that's if you think that you can do it without Jesus.
Yeah. So if you think that you're making this journey on your own, that you're walking in life and you're spiritually made yourself your own person, right? You're kind of dangerous ground there. Why?
You're not going.
You're not. You're not your own. And you will fail and you will fall. And then he gets to verse 13. No temptation. Again, I think it's testing. No testing will ever seize you what's common to man. And then he gets to the great three words, but God is faithful. But God is faithful. You in your testing, you might not be faithful, but God is. God will always be faithful. And he's not going to let you be tested beyond what you can bear. And then when you are tempted, when you are tested, he's always going to provide a way that you can stand through this. You may say, God, take this away, like they did for the snakes, and God would say, well, let's do it my way. Which means focus on me, and the test will still be there. The pain might still be there. The hurt may still be there. You still may get bit by snakes, but I'll take care of it. I will bring you through it. And that's the painful purpose of the wilderness. Because when you're stuck in the wilderness, in this barren place, when you finally realize that all I have to depend upon is God, what happens to you?
You're saved.
If you trust in God, He will take care of you.
You finally become his child. When you stop trying to be, no, it doesn't mean you're not responsible for things in life still. But in the wilderness, right, you have that faith. That's all that you can come down to. And that's where sonship and daughterhood gets established, in the wilderness. That's the pattern of the scriptures. Right? It was for Israel, God's son, in the Old Testament. It is for the New Testament, God's son forced into the wilderness. And so will we be any different? Probably not. That's what Paul is saying. Any specific questions that you got that we haven't yet touched on from what Paul is writing in this text? right. I'm ready to move on then if you are. Matthew chapter 4. And we looked at this a little bit on our Sunday morning Bible study, but we're going to dive a little deeper today. So chapter 4 immediately comes right after chapter 3, obviously. Chapter 3 was the baptism of Jesus. So Jesus, it ends with Jesus going into the Jordan River, where a reluctant John finally gives in to fulfill all righteousness. And Jesus submits himself to the baptism. He identifies himself with those who are confessing their sins, because he's going to bear those sins, right? And as soon as he's baptized, as he's coming out of the river, heavens are torn apart. The dove descends and the voice speaks. This is my son. He identifies him as the king, the one that he loves, the servant whom he's well pleased with. Okay. And immediately, right, John or Mark will say immediately after that, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. Could be understood as tested as well, right? Tempted, tested, interchangeable. Right? And it was led. How did he get there? He's led by the Spirit. It's not, I don't think Jesus was going, yay, now I get to go to the wilderness.
Plus he was really hungry.
Eventually he's going to get really hungry, right? So he's actually one of the, it's either Mark or Luke or one of them, it actually says ekbalo. We say led, and it literally means he's driven by the Spirit. The Spirit is driving him to the wilderness. I don't think he was going like all, yippee, party time, because he knows what's going to happen in the wilderness. This is the beginning of when he's saying, okay, I'm going to drink this cup, right? And when the night before he actually has to drink that cup, right, in the garden, what's he praying to God for? Take it away. Yeah. Can we take the cup away? He knows he knows that that's now already starting here in the wilderness, right? And so when his best friend in the middle of the book says, no, you're not going to go drink that cup, get behind me, Satan, right? Because he gets it. Satan's still after him, trying to deter him, which already starts here in the wilderness. Because what happens in the wilderness?
It's tempted.
Yeah, in the wilderness he gets tempted, but in the wilderness, throughout the scriptures, God uses the wilderness experiences to establish our sonship and our daughterhood. The same is going to be true for Jesus. So he's being tested in the wilderness by the devil. And after 40 days and 40 nights, again, probably mirroring what? The 40 days and 40 nights, what's that? Should be clicking in our minds.
40 years.
40 years. This is a wilderness wandering. 40 years, 40 days. It's kind of, the 40 is the big number. And he's hungry. And so the tempter came and said, in each of the temptations, the key word is the first word. Or the first word in this one at least, if. Right? Satan will use that every time in the 3 tests, if. Where did he use if before? Satan. Yeah. Did God really say? So here's the tempter. And he says, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. We got no miserable food, right? Same stuff. This is Israel failing in their test, right? When Israel was asked to trust God, he provided food for them. They grumbled and they complained. We got no bread. We got no water. All we got is this miserable food. Well, Jesus hasn't had food for 40 days, 40 nights. He's hungry. And tempter says, test him. You got the ability. Do that if you really are. So how does Jesus reply? Verse 3 or verse 4.
It is written.
What does that mean? It is written.
God says.
This has already been dealt with. This is from the scriptures. He's quoting Deuteronomy. In all 3 temptations, he quotes Deuteronomy 6 or Deuteronomy 8. which are part of Moses' sermons, preparing the people. Hey, you're getting ready to go to the promised land. We've been failing for 40 years, so stop failing. Start trusting. And that's what Jesus is reminding Satan of. Now, I find it very interesting, and I don't know if I ever have an answer for this. Jesus, we're assuming here, is alone in this whole scene, right?
That's what I think.
Yeah. Well, how does Matthew know about this then?
Good point.
He wasn't an eyewitness to it. Spirit, maybe. I think Jesus probably recapped the story for them. I mean, they spent 3 years together. We got to talk about stuff, right? And they're not just going to talk about fishing all the time.
Well, and this was important stuff to share.
It is. I think Jesus shares it with them. Yeah. I don't know that for sure. Maybe God just, told them. Now, when Mark tells the temptation story, he doesn't mention any of it. He just says Jesus was there in the wild and Satan was there, and he doesn't tell us the details of any of them. Matthew does and Luke does, but Mark doesn't. So I think Jesus probably relates the story to them. Could be, don't know for sure. But it's an interesting question to ask. But we got no answer, so definitive answer. But he does reply, it's written. And then he quotes Deuteronomy 6. Man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Right? Do we need bread?
Yes.
Yeah, we need food. God knows that, right? In fact, Jesus teaches us that to pray, right? Give us this day our daily bread. Give us the food that we need today. Right? So the devil gets thwarted on that one. So we get to verse 5. Then the devil took Jesus to the holy city, and he had him stand on the highest point of the temple, which is kind of interesting. Satan has just found himself on the presence of God's temple, the holiest place on earth, right? Who's still there? Satan. Yeah, the Satan is there. Wherever God builds a church, Satan sets up a chapel, right? He's there, right? Testing and tempting. And then he gives the first word. The very first word in this temptation is what?
Yeah.
If you really are the Son of God, right? Throw yourself down for here. And then what does he do? Satan
What's the Bible?
quotes the Bible, for it's written. He knows the scriptures, right? And he quotes specifically from a psalm, from Psalm 91. He will command his angels concerning you, that they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Right? So if your God is really a powerful God and you're his son, right, and he's establishing you as your son, you got work to do. Why don't you just go ahead and see if God's word is really true? Tricky, isn't it? And Jesus answers. What's his answer?
It's written.
It is written. It is known. It is written. Do not put the Lord your God to the test. Which is a quote now from Deuteronomy chapter 8. And Deuteronomy 6, I think. Yeah, Deuteronomy 6. In this context, when Moses is teaching the people in this section about don't put God to the test, is they kind of weren't they? When they would come to the water and they would grumble and they would mutter, we got no water. They're basically saying, God, hey, what you did for us yesterday, we don't trust you're going to do for us today. And they're putting God to the test, right? When God would just say, would you remember what I did for you yesterday? And trust I'll do that for you today? That when Moses hits that rock, you'll get your water. No, we won't. Well, what did I do for you yesterday? No, we won't. Can any of you relate to any of these things? Yeah, I can. But yet, Jesus responds. Let's not put Yahweh our God to the test. Let's trust he's dependable. So, In a way, Satan's trying to get Jesus to take the shortcut. Take the shortcuts, Jesus. Why go the long way of having to go to the cross? Take the shortcuts of becoming the Son. Could Jesus have done all those things?
Yes.
Could have thrown himself off and depended on God's angels to lift him up. All right, well, let's see. Verse 8. Again, the devil, the Satan, takes Jesus to a very high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All of this I will give you, he said, and then the word if. If you will bow down and worship me. Well, what seems a little ironic about this temptation or this test?
Jesus already has it all.
Yeah. Does any of the kingdoms of this world and their splendor really belong to Satan? No. None of it belongs to Satan. Who's made every square
Who's
inch?
working at it?
Well, he claims it, but is it really his? Who created all of it? Yeah, it's all God's. Yeah. Now, Satan counterclaims it, but it's an empty claim in the end. It's an empty claim. It already belongs to God. It already belongs to Jesus. Right? Satan's just saying, take the shortcut. Take the shortcut. Be the Son, but don't do it by the way of the cross and the cup that you're going to have to drink. Don't do it that way. Take the shortcuts. And Jesus replies in verse 10, away from me, Satan. Be gone, Satan. Right? Be gone, Satan. And then he quotes again, but it's written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Again, I think this is from Deuteronomy 6 again, which Moses teaches the people, right? Serve God only. Sounds like First Commandment stuff. And then the devil left him, and the angels came and ministered to him. And I think it's Luke that puts, the devil left him for a more opportune time, or another opportune time, which came when Peter said, no, Jesus, scolds him. I think another opportune time comes in the garden when the disciples are sleeping through their prayers and Jesus is praying the cup. Yeah.
Thinks he's going to get him in a moment.
Yeah. And I think there's probably a lot more things that happened to Jesus that necessarily didn't get written down, that didn't make it into the Gospels, of where he was trying to be sidetracked from doing this. I think one of them was the storm out on the Sea of Galilee. I think that was a demonic storm. I think that was Satan trying to get rid of Jesus and his band of 12. And Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves like he would casting out a demon. Those very same words. So, here's a question for again. Any questions or thoughts? Looks like you were about to say something.
I was just thinking about, Jesus isn't going to do that, but if the devil had overcome, or if he had gotten the best of Jesus, then none of our sins would be forgiven. He wouldn't have gone to the cross.
He wouldn't have.
And so that's the kind of love he has for us. That
And I think what's happening in the wilderness is not only is he getting a pattern, but he's learning he can depend on God. Because ultimately, when he's on the cross, and he's looking for God, where's God?
not there.
Nowhere to be found. And yet he's willing to commit himself. Father, into your hands I commit me. I don't know where you're at, but I commit my spirit. And then he breathes his last and he dies. And he's trusting that God will do what?
Do what he said he was going to do.
Which
Take
is
care of him and raise him from the dead.
on the third day.
Oh, yeah.
Raise him from the dead. On the third day. Yeah, he's got that ultimate trust that God will vindicate him. And on the third day he will be raised. So Jesus is having his sonship established now in the wilderness. I can depend on this guy. I can depend on. Now, one of the questions that you'll divide Lutheran theologians on is, could Jesus have failed? Could Jesus have failed in the temptation?
Was it a possibility?
Yeah.
I think because he was still also man, he had choice.
Okay.
So he was strong
Mhm.
because he had God with him and he had faith in that.
Good.
But he still had choice.
And now some will say, from theologians, Lutheran theologians will go, but he is still God, right? And that the attributes of the two natures forming in this one person, he couldn't have.
It wasn't a possibility.
It's not something that your salvation depends on, because I differ from those dudes. There's a lot of philosophy going on with those, and nothing wrong with philosophy and logical and to the ends thinking. To me, if it's he cannot fail, then it's really just a sham. Right? The whole thing's just a sham. If this test is something he could never have failed, then why go through it? It's just make believe, pretend. It's a sham. It's a rouse. But that's just me. I understand the attributes, the two natures of Jesus being formed into one person, and how that plays out. I just don't think that you have to take it to the nth degree in order to maintain the divinity of Jesus. Some theologians would say, no, you have to. Otherwise, it's not consistent. And I say, well, when we get to the eternal life and stand before the judge, and we can ask him. And when I'm right, I won't gloat much.
No, you can't because you'd be in
You're right.
heaven.
And if I'm wrong, I will forever never admit it. But I wouldn't do that either. Go ahead.
It had to, all these temptations were extremely taxing on Jesus.
Sure.
Because he had to have the angels did come in.
Yeah, they did minister to him, didn't they?
Yeah, so I mean, it took, so possibly he could have failed.
I think.
But it took
Well,
so
Satan
much
must have
strength.
believed that he could. That
Yeah.
otherwise, why would he
Why go
have
through
devoted the time to it?
He's always hoping we're gonna.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the Satan has been in the counsel of God, right? He's we know from the story of Job, he kind of has face-to-face contact with God.
Yeah, so most people can't see God, like Moses couldn't, I guess he did once. Or did
Only
he
saw the
ever?
backside,
Just, okay.
or in the burning bush. It was all something
Yeah, it was
was
always-
veiled.
But it almost seems like Satan could see that.
Yeah, Satan was in his counsel. Yeah. And in that counsel would have been Jesus in some form too, right? Because
Yeah.
Jesus is eternal and fully God. And so they were acquainted with one another. Now Jesus is in human form, which he, in fully human form. So he's in weaker, right? Theoretically, he's a weaker being right now because he's emptied himself, taking on the form of a man, and didn't consider that equality with God something to be used for his own favor. This is all from Philippians chapter 2, the hymn of Christ. So he is still God, but it kind of like he lays that aside, those powers, that doesn't use the being fully God to his own advantage ever, but rather walks the way that human beings have to walk, goes through the stuff that human beings have to go through, but does not fail. Does not fail. All right. Anything else? So we're gonna focus in on this idea of then the painful purpose of the wilderness. Right? There is a reason that God would take us out into barren places, and in the barren places we learn that God's dependable. That's why God sends us there, to test us, to help us learn that, to understand that, to believe that, to trust that, so that we're strengthened for our walk, right? And we're strengthened for our walk, where we can be then the sons and the daughters that God's called us to be. Doesn't mean we're not going to fail, right? And when we fail, we've got a God who's still faithful and dependable, and gives to us mercy and grace. Because that's the promise The painful promise of the wilderness is that God's grace is always sufficient. His grace is always enough. All right, I got nothing else. If you got nothing else, any other thoughts or questions? Cool. Let's close.